Hi, everybody. Today's Tuesday, February 17th, 2026, and our dear friend John Helmer is here with us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you, Nima. Thank you for having me.
Please hit like button helping us reaching more people. John, let me start with what is going on in Geneva. Everybody's talking about Geneva today because not only Iranians but Russians as well, they're gonna negotiate. They are negotiating with the American, negotiators, which we know that the is basically Steve Witkoff together with Kushner. And not much from Kushner, mostly Witkoff, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
What is the situation? Many controversies when it comes to the negotiations between Russia and the United States. Where are we with the negotiations?
Well, just technically and practically for everybody, yes, the meetings in Geneva are about to begin. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, has made it clear there'll be no press announcements today. They will not occur until tomorrow, so there'll be a 2-day period, and there'll be no real indication and no leaks, not at least from the Russian side, until tomorrow. So what we should focus on, what I know some of our audience find difficult to accept, is the enormous risk that President Putin is running now in the way in which he has divided these negotiations into the so-called economic cooperation team. That's really Kirill Dmitriev. That's a multi-point plan to give the United States pretty much everything they've sought for the return to Russia. Oil and gas companies to come back, their so-called losses compensated. We can go through the terms, and I've published them. These not only appeared in Bloomberg last week, I've been publishing them for more than a year now. And Bloomberg simply got a part of a memorandum of conversation that the Russian side does not deny to be authentic, that reflects Dmitriev's attempt to pacify the United States and put all trust in Trump to meet the promises he and his family have been bribed to accept, and he and his administration have been persuaded to accept as a new form of economic cooperation with Russia, including re-dollarization, which means the reversal of virtually all the major commitments that have been made to BRICS, to the Indian side, the Chinese side, and so on. That's the economic part. Now, there's been some controversy in the Russian press as to whether Kirill Dmitriev would be in the delegation in Geneva today. Late last week, it was reported that he would be, then he wouldn't be, and it's been clarified that he is in Geneva and he is meeting with Witkoff, Kushner, and Grunbaum, but not at the table for the negotiations on the Ukraine war settlement. So essentially, what has happened is there's a bifurcated set of negotiations that on the leaving aside the Dmitriev group, there's the main Russian delegation on the Ukraine war, and that's been principally military and led by Igor Kostikov, the admiral in charge for the general staff of Russian military intelligence. And he was being accompanied in Abu Dhabi by two generals, General Zorin, General Fomin. It's unclear whether General Zorin and General Fomin are in Geneva, but the Russian side has sent more than 20 delegates. The leader of the delegation is Vladimir Medinsky. Medinsky is a junior-ranking Kremlin assistant. Why does one send a junior-ranking assistant to lead after replacing the senior military intelligence officer in Russia? Answer: Medinsky's taking his instructions from the president, and these instructions have been hotly discussed and debated and disagreed with in Moscow. And we can see the evidence of that. I know some in our audience don't want to accept the evidence of this. They don't even want to accept that Russia is a form of democracy in which the military can disagree with the commander-in-chief, in which the foreign minister can disagree with the president of the country, and so forth. But there's no doubt Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, has indicated a serious set of disagreements with the terms that President Putin has seemed to offer on the Dmitriev plan, on the economic track. Why? Because Lavrov has said, and his deputy foreign minister, Sergei Ryabkov, repeated early this week, you can't trust the Americans. They have, in fact, escalated since the Anchorage, Alaska summit meeting. Now, the way in which this argument has been conducted in Moscow is through code words. The code words are Anchorage formula or Anchorage understandings. Each of the factions in Moscow say and believe different understandings were reached between Putin and Trump at their summit meeting in Anchorage last August. So each side says, yes, the Anchorage understandings, the Anchorage formula is the basis, but each side says they mean different things for addressing the military terms of settlement, the long-term security of Russia after the ceasefire, after the terms of settlement, the long-term future of Ukraine as a state, as an army, the forms of enforcing security so that the war will not be continued from whatever base is left of the Ukrainian regime. These are all terms that are yet unclear, okay? And the way this is debated with code words is either the Anchorage understandings have been violated by Trump himself, but not by Russia, or the Dmitriev plan. The Dmitriev plan is the other code word representing President Putin's short-term gambit. Some bankers I know have told me they think Putin is making a short-term bet that if he can bring the Americans back into Russia, re-dollarize, save the Russian oil and gas exports, he can reduce inflation, give the appearance of investment bonus, and boost the Russian economy from minus to plus. And the other evidence of how serious the internal situation is doesn't come from American podcasters who walk around Moscow saying how terrific things look to them. Just have a look at the central bank of Russia's analysis, its baseline scenario, its risk scenario, its projection of growth rates, and both positive and negative. At best, the central bank of Russia says, and it too walks around Moscow, and it too buys at expensive shops. The central bank thinks the best growth rate could be this year between 1% and 2%. But the risk is -5 to -7%. The risks are spelled out by Elvira Nabiullina. On paper, in speeches, is very clear. They believe that a short-term fix with the Americans can save the Russian economy this year as it goes into its, as it were, midterm crisis. That's the parliamentary elections coming on September 20. So, summing up, what's happening in Geneva? What's happening is a bifurcation of the Russian negotiating team. Second, a different set of instructions for Dmitriev, opposed by the instructions that have gone to the foreign ministry and the general staff negotiators. And we've got a president betting that he can somehow reach accommodations that depend on a level of trust no official in the Russian government except Elvira Nabiullina and Kirill Dmitriev believe in. That's where we are. So it's very high risk. It's a gambit. It can be argued as sensible, but it's a bet, a wager. And what's it a wager on? Trust in Trump. And who trusts in Trump these days?
Yeah. John, you mentioned that within the Putin administration there are some differences, which I think, in my opinion, it's normal to have
No,
these sort of
sure.
differences. But what do you think that Kirill Dmitriev is talking every time he's talking with with the American part? Are they in contact with the foreign minister of Russia as well?
No, no. I mean, it's very clear, and it's been clear from the very first meeting of the new Trump administration negotiators in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia back in February a year ago. It's very clear there's immense hostility, personal and policy related, between Sergei Lavrov and Kirill Dmitriev. Kirill Dmitriev represents the oligarch, the big business constituency. And from then on, he has promoted himself. He has a Twitter stream. He does. He leaks and to the Western press. Bear in mind, Kirill Dmitriev was educated in a U.S. high school. He was educated in U.S. universities. He was educated through graduate school in the United States. He thinks he is and knows the United States better than other Russians. He also thinks and trusts Witkoff, Grunberg, Kushner, and the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, and he met with them in Miami over the weekend of January 31. Now, that's when the memorandum of conversation that was fed to Bloomberg, either fed by the US side to cause trouble on the Russian side, or fed by the Russian side to cause trouble for Dmitriev, or a summary of what officials knew was said. That's where Dmitriev formulated that plan. But that plan's been underway. I first reported the terms of, for example, concessions in the aviation sector, particularly to Boeing on the Russian side, back in an article called The Oligarch's Picnic, which we published back in January of last year. Dmitriev has political ambitions, he has business ambitions in Russia, and he thinks that he has replaced Alexei Kudrin, the former defense minister, former deputy prime minister, as President Putin's principal foreign economic advisor. And he's aligned with Elvira Nabiullina as the principal domestic economic advisor, along with Mr. Silvanov, the finance minister. These people have been negotiating with their counterparts for more than a year now. I'm sorry, did I answer your question?
Yeah.
It's two tracks.
Yeah. John, when it comes to the Ukrainian territory, we know that the Russian foreign minister said, I think it's obvious in his recent interviews, that the Novorossiya are going to be all part of Russia. Do you feel that way? It seems that he's talking about from Odessa going up to Kharkov, it's all be Novorossiya, and they're going to be part of Russia. And their people in Russia talking about even Kiev and everything eastward going to be part of Russia, if to be, to correct, the whole concept of Novorossiya. What is Novorossiya in the mind of the official Novorossiya, in the mind of the administration?
Well, how to respond? Because half of what you said, I think, is accurate. The other half is speculative. I'm not saying that any of these speculations are mistaken. They are all reasonable ambitions on the Russian side, given the threat that all of the Ukraine represents as a battlefield, a spearhead for the endless war against Russia that began let's say in 1917, and intensified after 45, and so on. Here we are today. Let's just go to the pieces. And let's be also clear that the officials engaged in direct negotiations on the Russian side have not discussed particular details. So what we can see as apparent consensus on the Russian and American side, but not clearly on the European and the Zelensky regime side, is the readiness to accept less than all of Novorossiya, excluding Odessa, excluding Dnipropetrovsk, excluding Kharkov. That is to say, the Russian side appears ready to accept the territories the Russian army has won at great cost of blood, but no retreat from where they are now, and no acceptance of the various schemes Zelensky's offered for turning the parts of Kherson and Zaporozhye that are not militarily won and occupied yet by Russia into some form of free trade zone and nonsense like that. So one of the apparent territorial concessions would be all of the Donbass, meaning Lugansk and Donetsk, all and almost all of Zaporozhye and Kherson, but not Odessa and not Kharkov, neither the territories to the south and the west, nor the territories to the north. That's an apparent compromise, and I wouldn't bet money on how it will turn out at the moment. Second, you have the problem of the demilitarized zone. Going westward, what is the depth of the security zone in which no Ukrainian drone, missile, long-range artillery, or other form of a potential attack on Russia may be based? We know that the Ukrainians can fly long-range drones now from relatively deep into Western Ukraine. Let me say, I don't believe any Russian wants to occupy Kiev. No Russian wants the trouble of policing the Nazified Western Ukraine west of Kiev to the Polish border. The Germans occupied that area, and that area remains not only non-Orthodox and hostile to Orthodoxy, they are Catholics, they were Nazi sympathizers and collaborators during World War II. They would represent a constant form of terrorist resistance, costly in Russian lives. No one in Russia wants to occupy and regulate that zone. The problem from the Russian side is what sized army of the Ukrainians, what form of military equipment arming that army will be allowed, and whether there'll be any form of foreign, European, NATO, American intelligence sharing, military supply systems in that rump army. And though we've seen lots of different numbers, there's no point in my view of talking about numbers ranging from 800,000 to 500,000 to 80,000. These numbers have appeared on papers, they've appeared in leaks. The principle's different. The principle is, how does the Russian side ensure that its security will be protected from what comes after? On the Ukrainian side, they want maximum security guarantees they call from a Russian attack. What they really want is to maintain their position as a fighting platform against Russia, armed by the Europeans, given intelligence data and information and support from the United States and NATO. So the two sides are way apart on this. Now, the Russian side, my sources say, are confident. They've been told by the Trump administration, We don't wish to continue backing the, let's call it the Kiev regime with intelligence sharing. If the Europeans want to do it, that's fine. If the Europeans want us to support them, that's possible. But will you hurry up and do what you have to do? That's Russian sources are saying to me that that's what the Trump regime is saying to them. They think that's the case. Whether that's true or not, we're going to find out. And it's different, quite different from the principal terms. The roots of the conflict is the formula, the slogan, the code word that the foreign ministry uses for the outcome. Roots of conflict to be resolved require not only the return of the Donbass, the security of all four, a settlement of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant in such a way that it can provide power as much to the the Russian side as to the Ukrainian side. The depth of the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, the method for policing the DMZ by drone, by international supervision, and so forth and so on. Not only the depth, but then when you get to Kiev, what regime with what kind of electoral mandate would return to power, and what would their commitments be to restore the Russian language, the Russian church, and a non-racist, Nazi or fascist form of ideology that's prevailed. And then what exists between Kiev and the Polish border that might involve NATO, US, and other forces. Those issues are the root conflict causes that have to be solved.
Yeah.
And I don't see them being solved in Geneva.
What Zelensky was talking about in the Munich Security Conference, he was basically the main objective, it means right now, is the ceasefire. He said that give us the ceasefire, we're going to have a presidential election. Is that the main goal on the part of Europeans as well? And how is that going to benefit the whole case, the whole war in Ukraine?
Well, bear in mind, I'm the Russia correspondent, so I'm not going to I'm not going to talk about French politics, British politics, Belgian politics, Dutch politics, German politics, and Italian politics as they contribute to the answer to your question. You've got lots of good correspondents, and they can address each of their countries, okay? Nor is it fruitful to respond to things that Vladimir Zelensky has to say. It's not fruitful at all. What we can say, because we've said it many times, is the notion of ceasefire without a settlement, without a permanent security arrangement that protects Russia, is simply an invitation for relief of the Ukrainian side as the Russians advance westward, relief, refreshment, replenishment of men, of material, and so forth. So the notion of a ceasefire without a significant set of security guarantees of the range I've just mentioned is unacceptable to Russian side. It's said it over and over again. And from time to time, even President Trump has said he understands that a ceasefire without a deep security set of agreements is a no-go, is impossible. And from time to time, and we see it again this week, President Trump has made remarks in the back of airplanes and remarks in speeches that he thinks the Ukrainians have got to, quotes, come to the table, get ready to make agreements. By that, he doesn't mean he's agreed to Zelensky's ceasefire followed by elections. No. Elections can't be held without demobilization, without the end of martial law, the state of emergency in the Ukraine. A state of emergency in the Ukraine and a demobilization cannot happen without significant articles of capitulation from the Russian point of view, or a a multi-term peace agreement, and we've talked about this before, Nima. The Russian side presented its multi-term form of agreement, if I'm not mistaken, in Istanbul more than 6 months ago. Those set out in framework everything. And to the degree that we don't have everything solved, we can't have anything solved.
Yeah. John, you feel when it comes to the negotiations, there are people so much pessimist about what's going on between the United States. There are people optimist about what's going on. Where are you? Where do you locate yourself? Do you think that? No, because I want to know what is your understanding, because after more than 12 months of the some sort of negotiations between the two parties,
Yes.
what is happening? Who's the main obstacle to the achieving some sort of agreement between Russia and the United States? Who's that? Is that Europe? Is that Zelensky? Is that the situation that I don't know, the Americans are asking for, the conditions, the objectives that the Americans are seeking for? Is that the problem on the part of the Russians? Who's the main obstacle to an agreement between the two parties, which I believe it's going to be between the United States and Russia? It seems that even Macron himself said, we are not agreeing if the United States, negotiates with Russians and agrees on something, because Europe should be part of the negotiations, but currently they're not part of that, and nobody can ignore that.
Let's take the question several parts separately. First of all, it's very clear what Russian public opinion is on this point. Russian public opinion influences the Kremlin. It also reflects the messages the Kremlin makes to the Russian people in justification not only of the war, but of the serious casualties and losses that Russia has suffered. Russian public opinion believed that the Trump second term represented a positive opportunity to reach a peace agreement on the terms that Russia was at war with in the Ukraine. That optimism has been lost. Okay, Russian public opinion, and I'm looking to my left to see that the opinion polls, I can show it as a kind of I don't know if you can see it very well. I'll put it in the Dances with Bears later so that folks can look at it. It's an up and down line reflecting the way in which the Trump regime has first offered opportunity to Russia to come to a peaceful settlement, and then escalated sanctions, going up and down from hostility to peaceability. Russians do not trust the Trump regime any longer. The negative attitude to the United States is now 45%. Okay, 33% still have some hope the US will negotiate in good faith and can be relied on to honor their agreements. 22% say they don't know how to answer. Now, that's an interesting number itself. If the Russian public opinion, 1 in 4, thinks they don't know what the US is going to do and whether it can be trusted, why should we be any more certain and any more confident? So Russian public opinion is deeply distrustful of the United States, and that's a significant control or break, if you like, on anything President Putin will try to reach an agreement with now as we go into parliamentary elections next September. So fundamentally, that's the situation as Russians see it, not me, Russian public opinion, as measured reliably. Publicly, the Russian official line has been the Anchorage formula. That's to say, last August, everybody agrees that President Putin and President Trump reached understandings. What exactly they are has never been made clear. Therefore, the foreign ministry says those understandings mean the resolution of the deep sources of conflict, because we believe Trump offered a significant set of concessions which the Biden administration refused to accept. And second, why are we not yet signed? Because the Europeans have continually revived Zelensky's determination to go on fighting. So there is a line in Moscow that says, as you explained it, Nima, the Europeans are to blame for sabotaging a good deal the United States was agreeing with Russia to do as of last August, the so-called Anchorage formula. That is a public line. Is it true? That's what you asked me. Is it true that the reason that we aren't at a peace agreement with all of the Russian terms agreed is because the Europeans keep stimulating Zelensky to say no? Is it because the Europeans keep lobbying the Trump administration to tighten and escalate the campaign against Russia in trade, at sea, and so forth? In my view, there's no doubt the Europeans are part and parcel of a consensus. I don't see the Trump administration deviating very far from the European consensus on fighting Russia in the future. There's no change in US military policy. In fact, the US military policy is escalating at sea. The war against Russia at sea is escalating with Washington in the lead. The British have played second fiddle. The French have played second fiddle to the war at sea. If we take that as an example, it's not the Europeans resisting a peace initiative on the American side. Not at all. Not at all. So what to make of these differences of signals now that we're talking about them? Well, we have to say there are factions in the Washington establishment too. The Trump administration faces potential loss of Congress in its midterm election coming up November the 3rd. In that domestic political context we've explained before, the Trump administration must not appear to have lost the war in the Ukraine, must not appear to have triggered a war with Iran that causes massive inflation of the oil price, must not appear to have been defeated in battle. We've explained this a number of times before. So these domestic forces in the US lead the US to putting out multiple signals, some of which are long-term hostile to Russia, and not at all likely to lead to peace on the Ukrainian battlefield, or at least if they lead to a pause on the Ukrainian battlefield, they don't lead to any relief at sea, in Poland, in the Baltic states, in Finland, and across through the Arctic, and certainly not any relief in strategic arms limitations, starting with the installation of the Golden Dome in Greenland and what have you. Okay, so to answer your question, to summarize, I do not believe that blaming the Europeans for sabotaging peace in the Ukraine is accurate. The fact of the matter is the European governments believe, NATO believes, the US commanders of NATO believe that the battle has been lost in the Ukraine, but not the war against Russia. Now, that's a distinction they don't make in public. but their policies indicate that's their policy towards Russia. So their problem is how to go on fighting Russia because they believe the Russian economy is vulnerable, that politically, if the economy can be reinflated by war at sea and other means, we can get into that, President Putin will be seriously damaged internally and become even more vulnerable. That's what the Europeans think. That's what General Grinkevich, the US general and head of NATO, thinks. But subject to the limitation, they're losing on this battlefield. They've got to find a way of tactical operational withdrawal while maintaining strategic dominance. Escalation control. Combine the two. Don't lose on the battlefield. Maximize escalation everywhere else. Does that sound like a peace framework to you? It doesn't sound like it to me, and it does sound to me as if all the so-called European outliers are entirely in accord with the US on that strategic issue. But obviously, each of them is got a problem with Trump domestically. Trump's tariff measures affect France, England, Italy, all of them differently. Trump's attempts to interfere with the European trade agreement with India is an example. You've got economic warfare from Trump, which affects each of the European states quite differently. So they've got an individual state and a collective union problem with Trump, which is different from the question you raised for me.
Yeah. John, the war that you're talking about that is not lost on in the mind of American is the economic war. Is that the case? That's why the United States is trying to convince all these countries who are receiving oil and energy from Russia,
Yes.
To how successful that has been so far.
Good question. Don't know. I mean, the answers.
Let's focus on India, because I know that you
Yes.
you study India, you know India, you focus on India, and because we have two different stories from Russians and from Americans. Americans say that India is reducing. Russians are saying something different, that Indians have shown no sign of reduction of Russian oil and energy. Who's India in this game?
I put it a little differently. The way in which Trump's tweet announcing the reduction of tariffs for India was expressed, he said Prime Minister Modi had promised to stop buying Russian oil. Subsequently, Secretary of State Rubio has said that India has agreed to not to buy additional, he used the term additional Russian oil. Now, what's the difference? It's regrettable that public officials treating matters of state as serious as this cannot be questioned so that they are more specific and clearer. You and I have to answer, as do everyone else in the press, both mainstream and podcast and alternative media, to try to speculate on their near criminal vagueness. And it's criminal because it hides crimes. Okay, so what's the difference? The answer is that India will decide to buy Russian oil at the price that meets India's requirements. It will not stop buying oil from any source to put its own economy in danger. Prime Minister Modi and President Putin discussed this in December in Delhi. And it's understood that on the oil front, it's likely that India will reduce Russian oil purchases. That puts pressure on China to pick up the difference in Russian oil production that would have otherwise gone to India. Okay, and the Russian the Russians' volumes of production may have to be reduced for the following reasons. If India buys less, but not zero, if China, the so-called teapot trade, that's independent Chinese refineries in the south of China around Shandong, can no longer accumulate stocks of cheap oil coming from Russia because supply exceeds demand and the price discount has to fall. This is important. The Russian production has to be sold, therefore the price is cut till you find a buyer. The opportunistic buyers are diminishing in both India and in China. While this process continues and the discount enlarges and the effective price of Russian oil to Russia diminishes down below $40 a barrel, as that happens, the stocks at sea accumulate while they wait for buyers. Now, what's happening here is that Russian oil production at wellhead is being squeezed. Russian revenues, 30% of Russia's budget revenue comes from oil and gas production and tax. Oil products, that's crude oil and petroleum, amount to, between different estimates, different sources, between 45% and 60% of all Russian export value. What happens? If the effective price to Russia of the oil after the quoted Urals or quoted Brent or quoted WTI oil market price, let's say, I haven't got it right in front of me, but I think it's around 60 at the moment, falls. The central bank target for this year's economy, that's budget financing, revenues, and so forth, is $55 a barrel. 55. But the effective de facto price after discount now, by some reports, is between 37 and 40. Okay? 37 to 40 is significantly below the target on which the Russian budget works. Now, if you can't sell your oil at these low discounted prices, and if you can't, you must stop, lower production. And there's reports inside Russia that that's intended soon. The American side thinks, the European side thinks, the NATO side thinks we, meaning them, will add to the pressure on the tanker fleet, which roughly is 1,500 vessels carrying sanctioned Russian oil to market, so that all of the corridors, trade routes, sea lanes on which all of Russia's exports move will be threatened by the other side. What you have is a massive sea war, and not only on oil and gas. Okay? So if you've got this as a plan, it's not hard to understand why the Europeans, the Americans, the NATO alliance, and all their propaganda organs, all their think tanks, all their press say, we just have to keep fighting, keep squeezing Russia, and eventually it will die internally. It will be so squeezed that Russian people will throw Putin out. They will tire of the war. So they think this form of sea war, this form of war against oil and gas, this form of war that the Ukrainians add to by firing drones at Russian refineries and showing how far they can fire drones into interior Russia. This generates this confidence. I'm not saying it's justified. I'm just simply explaining why they think if they can continue the war for another 1, 2, 3 more years, Yes, we will, they think, sacrifice all the Ukrainian lives and even more territory, but Russia will suffer. And remember, the object of this war is to kill Russia. To the last Ukrainian, yes. To the last tanker at sea, yes. But if that's your objective, do we understand why the Europeans and the Americans both agree that if they can continue to fight, Russia may suffer significant strategic defeat? That's their confidence. So it's up to Russia to fight against that strategic confidence. And so we go back to where we started. President Putin has empowered Kirill Dmitriev to make the US an offer they think the US can't refuse, not to, including bribes that individuals won't refuse. If you come back into Russia, we will welcome you. We will let all your consumer product companies recapture. McDonald's will recapture its position in the market, etc., etc. And in return, you will relieve our sea lanes. You will relieve us in the sea war. You will relieve us to continue to sell oil at a price our budget and our internal financing, our central bank projections require us. That's a bet against a strategic war. I think that's what there is. And the discussions of European sabotage, of Zelensky sabotage, are operational. They're not strategic. The theory of European division from the United States is operational and domestic political. It's not strategic. Now, if Russia at Geneva today thinks in Dmitriev's room that that's not their strategy, President Putin's big bet is going to fail. On the other hand, if the short-term bet is the US will postpone its strategy, defeat Russia, then in the short term, President Putin's big Dmitriev bet will succeed. Now, who in our audience wants to bet a whole country and hundreds of thousands of lives, more millions, on the terms of this bet? Well, that's what presidents of countries have to do. And that's the bet that's running in Geneva today. I hope I've explained. I don't see the European division from the United States as strategic in nature, and neither do they.
Yeah. John, let me shift the gear a little bit to the other negotiations that are happening that I've mentioned at the beginning of this talk about the negotiations between Iran and the United States. How does Russia feel about the escalation in the Middle East and what's going on around Iran?
Well, it's very clear from the Russian side, any attempt to inflict regime change or wholesale destruction of Iran is a strategic threat to Russia. First. Second, Russia, including President Putin, has tried to resolve 200 years of, let's say, mutual and reciprocal suspicion, rivalry, military warfare, and terrorism between the old Persian Empire, the old Russian Empire, and then Soviet Union and Iran allied with the United States, the Shah's Iran, and so forth. 200 years of mutual suspicion and competition and rivalry can't be resolved quickly. True. So President Putin has made a record, let's say, an ambiguous record of trying to rebuild trust between his government in Moscow and the government in Iran, including the supreme leaders. At the same time, we know, and you know better than me, that there have been factions in Tehran, political and military, that have not trusted Russia for historical reasons. Also, I believe that there's a reasonable concern on the Iranian military side that Iran cannot afford to become dependent for its air defense, its anti-missile missile defense, its navy, its drone and offensive capability, on which Iran's capability to deter Israeli attack depends. Iran must be self-sufficient. That's how I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, that the IRGC in particular believed it needed to become self-sufficient in anti-missile defense and anti-aircraft defense, and was suspicious of the Russian side until the June war proved that the other side, the US and the Israelis, were capable of overwhelming the air defense in the first phase. And were capable of assassinating a significant part of the Iranian military leadership. That shock, an understandable one, a serious tactical defeat, has led, and forgive me if I misread this, to a revision of the necessity for self-sufficiency on the Iranian side to become more cooperative with Russia and China. And these are suspicions that are shared everywhere. Everyone knows, particularly in India, that if you buy from the United States F-16s or any other form of serious offensive or defensive military warfare, you suffer the possibility the Americans will hit the kill switch, which stops you using the equipment you need for your determination of your defense or offense. The kill switch and the suspicion of the kill switch will always damage US weapons sales to major powers like India. Therefore, the suspicion of the kill switch must exist in Iran and must exist not only to the United States, but to the Russian side. Now, let's remember what happened at the beginning of the June war. As the Israelis attacked targets all over Iran, President Putin rang up Prime Minister Netanyahu and asked him not to attack the Bushehr nuclear reactor in southern Iran because it risked the lives of Russian technicians. And Netanyahu agreed. I'm not disclosing anything that I haven't reported before. It's well known. Now, if he did it then, it's reasonable for the Iranian side to say, if there's a new attack, will President Putin ring up Netanyahu in advance and say, I don't want you to attack my Russian air defense technicians in this, and this place? Might that happen? I don't know whether it would happen or not. What I'm saying is that what happened last June arouses a reasonable suspicion on the Iranian side that for all the US podcasters who tell us how committed Russia is to the defense of Iran, it's reasonable for the Iranian side to say we must preserve our capacity to defend ourselves if the Russians pull the kill switch. Why should they trust Russia more than President Assad of Syria did when the kill switch was constantly pulled by President Putin, exposing Russian lives to Israeli attack in Khmeimim in years past? This is a story everyone in the Middle East understands and knows. So, to sum up, Russia is committed to defending Iran and heading off the alleged basis of Israeli-American attack on Iran, which is enrichment of nuclear nuclear weapons capability, enrichment of uranium to nuclear weapons capability, to find formulas that the Americans would agree to accept that would remove that issue as a ground for attack. Fine. That's helpful and credible. Iran has made it very clear it cannot and will not negotiate any variation on its missile defense and offense capability. And you've had Theodore Postel explain exhaustively how the Iranian capability now establishes a significant balance of deterrence against Israel, because that capability, as Postel explained to your audience a few days ago, would destroy Israeli cities. Okay. Accepting what Postel's analysis amounts to means that missile program limitations are off the table. What's left? You tell me what's left. Russia would then be in a position to offer the American side a way out of an exit for the Armada. You've had people on your program assuring you that they've heard from their unidentified sources that the US and Israel will attack. You've also heard equally credible people say, no, there's a balance, a brinkmanship that's achieved a mutually deterrent balance right now on the edge, in which the Trump administration can't attack for American reasons, including the closure of the Straits of Hormuz and a skyrocketing oil price. So people differ on the evidence, on the sources. What's Russia's contribution to this? It's to maintain ambiguity, strategic ambiguity, so that the US side and the Israeli side can't be confident that Russia will, do what President Putin did with Netanyahu over the Bushehr reactor at the beginning of the June war.
The only disagreement I have with your comment on Syria is that Syria is different from what we have between Russia and Iran, because it's somehow the nature, the identity of the relationship between Iran and Russia is totally different, John.
Of course.
Syria is far, far from the reality of what's going on between Russia and Iran.
I agree. We don't disagree. I used the Syrian example only as an example of Russia pulling the kill switch in exactly the way others suspect the US of pulling the kill switch, to disable an air defense system and allow an attacker to operate. And that's what President Putin did for Netanyahu's benefit in Syria. I only meant it as an example of the Russian kill switch and the suspicion that the Syrian precedent or the Iran precedent of the June war arouses reasonable suspicion that it won't happen again. And that's a problem President Putin has to resolve publicly, because those two events were his personal decision. Therefore, he has to provide the reassurance. And until or unless he does, the suspicion remains. I don't see why those in the audience who disagree with this analysis disagree with the evidence. The evidence is there. And the, let's call it, positive relationship at the military and intelligence sharing level between the Russian side and the Iranian side contributes significantly to deterring Admiral Cooper from launch, President Trump from launch, and the Israelis from launch. And strategic, that's an operational deterrence. and you've had Ted Postel explain the strategy of deterrence. So we've got operational deterrence, strategic deterrence, and those are factors that ultimately reflect Iranian self-sufficiency. Yes, Postel said it. With additional Chinese and Russian help, the targeting accuracy of Iranian missile capability can be reduced from 1,000 meters to 500 meters CEP. And look, he's the expert. Your audience can go back and listen again to the way he spelled this out, because it's strategic deterrence Iran has acquired. What he also said was whether the Chinese or the Russians help, Iran's got sufficient capability for strategic deterrence now with non-nuclear weapons. So that's a breakthrough.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, John, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you, Nima. Let's see how our forecasts, that we haven't made too many forecasts about this negotiation. Let's see how things turn out and come back next week and do a post-mortem.
Yeah, exactly. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.